Welcome to MOTS, where we'll be applying the Manzer or Mosi-Thurlow scale of quantitative analysis of pop culture narrative through a binary system.
Or MOTS! This podcast contains spoilers, mature content, and language. Viewer discretion advised.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of MOTS. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Stephen Ramosi.
Hello.
And Scott Thurlow.
Hi there.
Today we are doing a pretty heavy movie called Spotlight. So, in order to alleviate some of the heaviness, Scott, would you like to give a funny logline for the movie?
Yes, I'll try to bring some levity to this rather heavy movie, as you mentioned. I came up with In the Mouth of Molestation.
Certainly. Steve, would you like to actually give the true synopsis of this movie?
Sure. There is a group of reporters who are known at the Boston Globe, known as the Spotlight team, I guess, and they are kind of floundering for a case to work on, and they stumble upon this, or are kind of assigned this molestation case that's been building in Boston, and the entire film is about them kind of chasing down leads and trying to figure out what's going on in Boston. As it turns out, they find out that more and more of the Catholic Church priests are involved in unsavory behavior towards the children of Boston, basically. And as they continue on, they kind of uncover this gigantic tragedy that's kind of befalling their city. All these kids are being molested by all these Catholic priests. And I think when they finally print the piece, they print off something like 70 names. And at the end of it, it even goes further than that. And there's a lot more people that are involved in this thing. That's the basic synopsis. I think we're going to get a lot more into details as we go on. But
if you remember all of the press that happened over the past decade and a half dealing with the scandal and the cover-ups in the Catholic Church, this is where it started.
Yeah.
Right.
So, without further ado, Scott, would you like to talk about the introduction?
So it starts off with sort of a prologue. What's happening is that a priest is being held in the local police department on charges, and a lawyer is there, who we'll come back to later, and two cops are talking, and I believe one of them... It's setting up like the whole conspiracy, or like how far back it reaches. And one of the cops guards says, what about the arraignment? And the other cop says there won't be any arraignment. And that's sort of an indicator of like how deep-rooted the cover-up goes. And then it goes on to focus on the Boston Globe writers, the Spotlight team, as Steve mentioned, and John Slattery plays their editor in charge. Like he's like,
yeah, I think he's one of the head editors,
right,
or
right,
at least a managerial position.
Right. So so one of their editors is retiring, and they're bringing in a new guy, formerly of the New York Times, and also worked in Miami to fill the position. He comes in, and the Spotlight team is working on a story they don't think is that great, but it's what they've got. And the Liev Schreiber plays the new editor named Marty, and he sort of turns him on to, or like points him towards possible Catholic Church corruption cover-up for the priests molesting children and being sort of shifted around, and the entire even the law side of it participating in the cover-up. So I think that the introduction sort of starts off when they get assigned the story and decide to start running with it and start digging into it a little bit more. They look up their own archives, see what they've already reported on. They find not much. I think
there's this shot when they're all kind of running upstairs, or they're going to different locations right at the beginning, going to the archives and all that.
Yeah.
I think that's right at the start of the body.
I think I agree. Yeah. Something like that I think I would cut it off. So yeah, I would think it was a good setup. It certainly introduces the issue they're going to address, and it gives you sort of a brief overview and how far back it reaches, and the people who are going to be investigating it. And this I don't think we mentioned, but this is based on an actual story. This actually happened. Yes. So it sets you up with the characters who were there at the time working it. And I think it was a good setup. So we'll get to this when you get to characters, I believe. But they give you enough of them. It's not. But the thing is, the point of this movie is not really about the characters themselves per se. It's just about them doing their job and uncovering the story.
Well, that's a point for argument later.
All right. But regardless, I think it did a fine job. It was a fine setup. Nothing was confusing. It was very straightforward. As it sort of needed to be. I couldn't see them doing it any other way.
They do a good job of setting up Michael Keaton as Walter Robbie Robinson, who, by giving him letting him give a speech to the retiring editor, right. I thought that was he developed his character very well.
It's a good intro. Yep.
Yeah.
They also made Liev Schreiber's character almost menacing, and they established that his kind of an alien presence, an outsider presence.
Yeah, he's not born and bred in Boston and so forth, and everybody sort of views him with a little bit of a suspicion. They think he's going to cut jobs and so forth. Yeah. They don't necessarily respect him, even though he's big time within the industry. But as you said, they view him as an outsider, so they're sort of distrustful of him, just kind of coming in and taking over their paper.
So yeah, again, I felt very much at that point. You understood everyone's role in the paper very well, and who took orders from who,
and how they work with
the
each
hierarchy,
other.
all that. So
yeah, and you got the feeling of this like close knit team with the Spotlight group, and then you kind of got those people above them, and you saw the whole
dynamic,
paper.
I guess.
Well, and you saw all the people that are there for the paper, but you immediately understood that they weren't really part of this story.
Right.
It gave you a good jumping off point right away.
Sure.
I think.
Sure, I think it was fine set up. I'll probably give it a 1.
yes.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I'm going to give it a 1 as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought the beginning, this might carry into body a little bit, which is probably because I'm going to be talking about the body, but I think they did a very good job of really establishing the inner workings of the paper.
Yeah,
and how you get to see the Metro section, you get to see what stories went to whom, and I don't know, again, I actually felt that it focused maybe considering the themes that they were discussing, I felt maybe it focused a little too much on the paper to begin with, but it quickly went away from that and into the heaviness that will be the body.
Just real quick, sort of like thought of us, it reminded me of both All the President's Men and perhaps Bedtime for Bonzo, in the sense that it's the inner workings of a newspaper who's uncovering a scandal of some sorts, and you can see, as they uncover more and more of it.
Well, speaking of Bedtime for Bonzo, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail for the body because it's a really detailed description of how they systematically
they're just tracking down various leads and uncovering more things and getting running into walls and people stonewalling them,
exactly,
so forth.
So I'll give you a couple of highlights. Stanley Tucci plays an attorney who's working on actually kind of trying to bring this to light, the entire scandal. He's representing a number of molestation victims, and he plays this kind of eccentric lawyer with kind of an anger issues. He probably had the most character of any of the people in this,
or at least the most interesting character.
He played the eccentric, and that worked well. And you got to see each group. Rachel McAdams was hunting down victims,
tracking them down and
interviewing them. While Mark Ruffalo's character was attempting to get files brought to light so that they settlements that had been made prior. So again, from that description, you can see how this is very. They don't glamorize this at all, nor should they have. But it's straight facts. Here's how this worked. Here's how long it took to find all the details.
It's very procedural.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
In the way that it goes about it, and I thought it was kind of interesting that of all these characters, I think that every character in this is a supporting character, which we'll talk about later. But I think it's really interesting how they kind of turn the people into the secondary part of this, and the story is what really takes the forefront.
Yeah, because of the nature of the material, it sort of has to be that way, but I think it was pulled off well. So yeah, it's like you said, the body was basically their investigation and how it was unfolding and what they ran into and what they pieced together and just tracking down information.
But I feel that this would have made a better nonfiction book than necessarily work as a movie, because I wasn't disinterested, but it's very, very heavy.
It's just
and
the
very,
facts,
very
Jack,
slow.
if you will. I'm sure. So.
Right, but would you have read it if it was a nonfiction book as opposed to?
I've read similar.
Maybe.
As opposed to how many more people know about this now or have watched this movie?
I want to get to that point
movie.
later, though. But I just want to talk about how it was pulled off right now, regardless of intention. And it's very interesting, and I think it's an important storyline. It's just I have to unfairly compare this to The Big Short, which what we just watched the other day, which was another real event about people figuring out this big scandal and fraudulent activity going on. Granted, this could never be done in the same style because Big Short tried to make it lighthearted. But that was accessible, where I feel that this movie fails in accessibility, and The Body really shows that it's you have to be interested.
It requires more of a commitment.
Yeah, very much so, and you have to be. I feel that you have to be of a certain frame of mind to actually be able to sit through this. You have to be of a certain type of. You have to be a person who'd be willing to read a nonfiction book about procedural aspects of how this happened to enjoy this movie.
I suppose so, but just by the fact of what this was about makes it somewhat accessible to a lot of people. Like, this is something that's interesting to anybody who's Catholic in this country, even if you don't like it, or even if you want to try to avoid it. It's something that affects you.
Sure.
And there are a lot of Catholics in this country, or a lot of people that
and in Boston specifically
follow, especially in Boston, or a lot of people that follow what's going on with the Catholic Church. Even if you're not Catholic, similar to the way that most of this Spotlight team were lapsed Catholics. However, they all knew a lot of things having to do with the church because of how they had grown up.
Sure, because of the general culture, yeah.
Right.
I'm going to make two more points on The Body.
Okay.
One I thought was actually, I think, the most interesting angle that they played up in this film was the silence of the community. That everyone who had connections knew what was going on, and it was that kind of that argument of the only thing that allows evil to flourish is a good man to sit by and do nothing.
Strangely enough, that part, and you almost made a direct quote, reminded me a lot of Boondock Saints because of the Boston thing,
connection,
and because that was one of the main themes of that. Like, the real evil is standing by and letting men do evil, or whatever the exact quote is. It's that idea of letting evil flourish because no one's willing to stand up and say something, and that specific part of it just kind of, and because it was in Boston, kind of got me in the mind frame of that. But anyway, what was your second point?
The second point was where the body finally cuts off, and I think when they start actually putting the story together.
Yes, I agree with that.
So they go through a little bit of the procedure of getting validating sources.
Yep.
At the very end, we can't publish this until we make sure that every single. I believe they find it was 70 priests. At the end, we need to make sure we can validate, because if we leave one unsourced, that'll be the chink in our armor that they can pull everything.
Yeah. Yep, they do.
Right.
It's an outright line. Yep.
Yeah. So I think that's a fair assessment of when the body
I would
cuts
agree.
off.
And I have a point maybe to make. Maybe I'll save it for a little bit later. But yeah, because the nature of this material, they have to present it to you in a sort of straightforward manner. But is that necessarily all that entertaining? But it's hard to make this subject matter entertaining in general, in a sense. So yeah, I think it did a good enough job given with what it was going to be working with.
Right. I think to make this movie entertaining, you would have had to fictionalize a lot of things that happened, and I don't think that that's what they were.
And that'd be
going
doing
for.
discredit to the actual story.
Well, there's a fine line between, though. You guys both found it more accessible than I did. But there's a fine line between adding entertainment value for the sake of that and
No, I agree.
just giving something that I don't know. It's there's something about it that's too dry. That it's like eating. It's between having a dessert and just eating crackers, and there's a balance in there somewhere. I've seen movies that did it well.
Sure, I think we said that upon viewing that it was a little bit dry, but again, maybe necessarily so. But I'm sure how else they were going to present it.
But I can't just hoist it on a pedestal because of the theme alone.
Sure.
And it doesn't make it infallible because it's touching upon something about people who thought they were infallible molesting children. So overall, though, I'm going to give it a 1 because I think it captured what it wanted to very well.
Right, I would agree with that.
I'm giving pretty much the same reason. It's a solid 1. It did the best it could with what it had, and within that, it was perfectly fine, serviceable.
And this is something that I mentioned earlier to you guys. I think it was interesting throughout, and I don't think that they included anything that was extraneous. I think that the entire part of the procedural was interesting.
It
and
made
important
sense
to their
yes.
case.
I think I want to say it was paced out pretty well. even if, again, it was dry-ish at times, it didn't shuffle anything around, like you said, needlessly, nor introduce something
it
that
did not belabor any points
Yes.
either. So
Yeah. So I'll give it credit on that
Yes.
front.
So then we'll move on to conclusion with Steve.
In the conclusion, the documents are released that kind of show that the cardinal was covering all this stuff up, and that's kind of what they need.
It's like their smoking gun that
Right.
they can finally push.
They're really
push
trying.
forward.
They're really trying to nail the system and not just these priests, because that can be covered up. So they kind of get those documents. Robbie asks for some more time to get the whole story. So they do that. They get the rest of the story, and they're given 6 weeks to do it.
Just for reference, Robbie is Michael Keaton's character.
Right.
He's the editor of.
He's the head of the Spotlight team.
Yes.
Yeah. And so they get the story out. The story finally drops, and you kind of get all these reaction shots of members of the team, and also members of
Like their family members, relatives,
right.
and so
So
forth.
Rachel McAdams'
The community.
character, Sasha, has been mentioning throughout that she used to go to church all the time with her nana, and then she stopped going as she was doing the story, and then she's watching her grandmother read the story and just be completely destroyed by it.
Sure.
So there's those types of shots, and that type of thing happens. It's not a really drawn out conclusion, which I think was good.
I think the movie did a good, knew that, was aware of it,
Right.
and did it well.
Right, and that's kind of it. And then they do a cards at the end.
Follow up facts, if you will.
that kind of tell you what happened, and then they show, I don't know how many it was, probably 100 other cities that have had since then stories about,
And not just in the U.S.,
Right.
around the world.
right, yeah, there are a bunch of them. It went by way too fast to read all of them, but I remember seeing Manila.
Yeah, there was I think
And,
maybe 3 or 4
London.
screens of
There's a
maybe
bunch of-
20 to 30 each.
A bunch in Australia, a bunch
Yeah,
in
Yeah.
Sure.
the Philippines.
So it's all over it's just becomes this worldwide story that just kind of unravels. And then I think one of the last things that they say as well is that the cardinal had to resign his post, but then he was just reassigned somewhere else in Europe.
A high place in near the Vatican.
Right.
Actually, I looked that up afterwards, and it's true that he got reassigned to a very, very nice post in the Catholic Church, and then eventually he resigned by old age.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
to compare it again to The Big Short, it's not only a heavy film dealing with a ton of
Uncomfortable subject matter.
uncomfortable subject matters about how the system is very corrupt, but it leaves on the same note that nothing really changes.
Right.
That for all the good work that these people did in breaking, no one got punished really. All the victims still remain. Yes, they uncovered an awareness, but even just that, I can't think.
The machine chugs on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like a running theme of a lot of these types of stories, and it's kind of sad actually. There's nothing.
It
that
is
happens to
depressing,
these
for
people.
sure.
Once you reach a certain level of power, doesn't matter what gets found out about you, what you did. You're just going to be moved out of the spotlight and
If you will.
left to
Name
if-
drop.
if you
Title
will.
drop.
Titular line.
Well, I remember in news, the brother of the Pope Benedict was recently. He was running a school where hundreds of people got molested or something like that. It's still going on today.
Yeah.
Journalists are still uncovering the corruption, and yet the system still remains. It's very so I like this movie was heavy, and it didn't really leave a lot of hope at the end.
Right.
Well, good segue into our next topic.
Again, I think this was a very well done movie for what it was attempting to do, and again to your point that you said earlier about the conclusion wasn't overdrawn. It wasn't belabored at all.
Right.
It functioned well, so I'm going to give it a 1.
Same here.
I'm going to also give it a 1, yeah.
Scott, themes.
All right. Well, of course, we mentioned a bunch of them, but I think, like I said, it was a good segue. It's basically corruption, specifically in this case, the Catholic Church corruption, specifically covering up all the cases of molestation that are apparently rampant and possibly still are. So it's humanity being dicks again, pretty much, in light of one specific topic such as this. And I don't see how you can fail to give it a good score, because I don't like to also compare it immediately to The Big Short, but they are sort of crossed over on the Venn diagram of important social issues that need to be brought to light. And the people who did bring them to light, sure, now we know, but what has really changed? And yes, that's quite depressing. Humanity is often depressing to me.
Yeah.
But regardless, I think it handled the theme really well. Like I said, it's hard to put levity into this, but I think it treated the portrayals of its victims with respect. And the people, specifically Rachel McAdams' character, was shown to be sort of more invested. Not that per se, but she was the one interviewing many of the victims, and she was very sympathetic to them, and deservedly so. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too personal into this. I have a grudge against the Catholic Church and religion in general, but specifically them. I think they deserve to be brought down a peg. But like Steve said, there are certain circles of power in which no matter what is brought to light, you probably won't get punished necessarily for it. But nevertheless, I think this is an important one. We'll probably discuss this a bit more about it, perhaps on our general Oscar recap show coming up. But either way, I'm giving Themes a 1. It was well, I didn't know much about the history of this the Spotlight, uncovering it. So at least it was interesting to find out some facts about it.
Well,
and good.
Interesting side note: when this was breaking in 2001, you and I were just out of Catholic
That's true.
high
We
school,
had just started college, yes.
And these types of things were never talked about when we were going to school.
Sure.
It wasn't anything that you even noticed or thought about, but there were kind of always rumblings when you were at Catholic high school about stuff like this, and you kind of just ignored it.
I would like to bring up a secondary theme because there's really nothing much to add to the main theme.
Right.
It deals with the importance of journalism very well.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned the other films, so sure, I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's, again, maybe I'm putting in the context of other works I've seen, like The Newsroom, for instance, was dealing with how cable news versus online journalism. This is showing that print journalism, at least investigative reporting, is not just some fly-by-night, we get a hint and we publish it immediately.
Yeah, no, it takes a lot of work, a lot of time, and a lot of
years
digging.
They're saying some of these stories take, and it took them months and months to dig up everything, hounding people. So, again, yes, you can't take away from this major theme that they're saying, but I think that it really showed the power of print journalism, which is soon to be extinct.
Sure, and I guess I want to just mention one thing real briefly, and hopefully won't go too far into it, but because of when it was happening, as you said, 2001, there was a brief part in the movie where they were deep into their investigation, uncovering a lot of things, and they were about to go forward, and then 9/11 happened. So it sort of almost suggested that this story was overshadowed by that. Just happened to be bad luck that that's something that happened when they were in the midst of their investigation, and they had to go forward with it. And then they wait. I think they said something that it was just after New Year's and after 9/11, so early 2002 is when they finally were able to put all the pieces together and get it out. But to your point, Heath, that was sort of an interesting thing to you can't foresee something like that when you're in the news. You spend so much time and effort uncovering one story, and then something even more ridiculous happens that needs coverage, and it was demoralizing to them and perhaps demoralizing in general. But
I think it was 6 weeks.
Yeah,
they were
I think
delayed
that sounds about
because
right.
of it.
Yeah, I believe they did say that.
That was when they started picking up their case again.
Yes.
But the story didn't come out until what is it? January 2002.
Yeah.
It was right after New Year's, is what they said.
Yeah. So I thought it was somewhat interesting, and just to the themes in general. But I'm definitely giving it a 1.
And you kind of touched on this, and I just want to speak about it briefly. But the inaction of people who are portrayed as good people is a major theme is another part of that. Is another part of the theme that you spoke about as well.
It's a sub theme, if you will.
Right, and that's always kind of an interesting thing to me. Is and I sometimes see in myself where I see something wrong, and you see something, you don't say anything. It's usually not a big deal, but you think back and you say, I could have or should have said something about that. But this is the entire world, basically.
Certainly a large community, yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to say maybe something a little bit controversial here, but this movie is a little heavy-handed at times with the theme.
I mean, I agree with that, but again, it's a double-edged sword. I get it.
So at one point they compare everyone to Nazis who are And the other guy's like, you can't do that. Yeah, but you said it and then took it back so that...
No, I know. I noticed that line as well, yes.
I've noticed many times in the film, not many times I'd say, but
there's a few
occasionally
spots. I'll give you another one when you're done.
Go ahead.
There was one where when Mark Ruffalo's character, him and Rachel McAdams probably struggling the most, like as they uncover more, and like it's affecting them more deeply. And it's right on Christmas, and he goes to the church and sees the children's choir singing, just like staring, like basically it's implied like any of these kids or all of them are in danger of being molested. And like, yeah, film, I understood that. Your entire point already. Like that scene was sort of unnecessary, so that's where the heavy-handedness comes in. Was it egregious? No, but was it noticeable? Absolutely.
Yeah,
I agree with that. But still, regardless, I'm going to give it a 1.
Yep.
I'm gonna give the themes a 1 as well. I think that they did a good job.
All right, now I'm going to move on to the antagonist. Now, obviously, it's the Catholic Church here. They have a cardinal law who kind of plays the face of all this.
Not a law. His name is Cardinal Law.
Yeah.
Sorry. Might be confusing there because of the name of the character in person.
I believe Cardinal Bernard Law.
Yes.
I think this movie does a good job of making the antagonist not wholly the Catholic
They're not
Church.
Completely villainous. It's
No, but I'm not even saying they're redeem them at all. I'm just saying that I feel that the major theme was everyone else who allowed it to happen.
Sure. All the complicit people. Yeah.
From the lawyers who, I'm just doing my job, to the people who say that, I like the mother of a molested child who says, well, I can't smear the name of the Catholic Church
because of one person.
Religion.
Yeah.
You had journalists prior to them who failed to find this story. So and the people who don't want to hear it because it would affect their established worldview. And their happiness in their world, that the church does such good things, we can overlook this. I think that's the main antagonist of this film.
I think they also dropped in a really nice thing that I liked, is that they uncover a psychiatrist, I believe, a psychotherapist, who was studying the phenomenon of molestation in the church for 30 years. He was one of their deep background experts, and they talked to him a couple of times. And I believe it was Mark Ruffalo's character was on the phone with him, and he says, are you still Catholic? He goes, well, of course I consider myself Catholic. It's a difference between faith in the institution itself, which I think is an important distinction, and it was very clearly pointed out. But I think it was nice of them to have that line in there.
They also, from the very opening scene, though, you see cops standing by, not doing anything. You see the lawyer coming in, allowing this to happen. So it's
a whole chain of
it's
community.
Institutionalized silence.
Yep,
that's basically what's
exactly
going on.
Yep,
and it runs so deep that everybody's terrified to say anything.
You got to go along to get along, and that's what everyone thinks. Black sheep,
you know.
Agreed. So I agree with that as the general antagonist, and again, a sub antagonist as well.
I mean, it was a real antagonist, and it affected
it still is,
and still is affecting,
of course,
however many millions of people.
What I find interesting is they talk about the hand of God coming down from the Catholic Church. But when you actually see it, it's not really effective. It's one guy comes up and they're like, hey, you shouldn't be publishing this. We don't appreciate it.
Yeah.
But there's no repercussions. It's more of both institutionalized silence and kind of this boogeyman that, if we rock the boat, grave
some unforeseen, some unnamed disaster will befall us. But
it turns out to be almost an idle threat in the end. And so, I think the failure of every single... Boston's the villain.
I don't necessarily agree with that, but I will give it a 1 to the other things we just said.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a 1 as well.
I will as well. Steve, it's on to you for protagonists.
So, protagonist, normally I would never do this, but I'm not going to name any characters as protagonist. I think I mentioned that earlier. The story is really the protagonist of this, and the truth of what's going on.
No, I mean, I agree with that. As pretentious as it sounds, first of all, Ian, you should love that as a pretentious statement, but I think it's fairly solid.
We spoke about this earlier when we were talking about the film. None of these characters are really the focal point of this.
Right.
It's an ensemble piece.
Yeah.
Well, not only is it an ensemble piece.
It's not a character study.
The ensemble is not the protagonist either. The newspaper crew is not the protagonist. What is the most important thing in this, and what is being acted against, is the truth coming out and the story coming out. So... I mean, that's my take on it. If you have a different take...
Let me... fine. You want to draw a couple more comparisons to Big Short? I believe one of the title quotes in the Big Short title little cards was, truth is like poetry. Most people fucking hate poetry.
Yes.
So like that's sort of like the same thing here. I agree with you in the like you sort of stole my answer, but yeah, the characters were there not to be like main characters. They were in service of the story that we're trying to tell, the story of corruption.
No, because you have. I'm going to go back to the good men versus the silence.
Okay.
And that it's two, in a sense, tidal forces clashing against each other. I would say Liev Schreiber is one of the protagonists because he set
it in motion. I guess I would agree with that, but
right. But
and the Spotlight crew is one because again, without them, the status quo would have remained. The silence would have remained.
I mean, it's hard to cut this
so
one out.
you're saying that the truth, but there's no agent of truth there. And that's what the Spotlight crew does.
They are the nexus of that. Yes. They're the weapon that is used against, the church. However, I would say that you could fill in any newspaper crew with these guys. And you said earlier, not on record, but I'm putting it on record right now, none of these characters is really carrying the film. None of these characters are...
That's why I'm giving it a 0.
Fair enough. But I have to look at it as the main character, the important part of this is the story. That's what I took out of this. And like I said, normally I would never do this. I prefer to have a concrete person as a protagonist.
Like things clear cut.
Person or people if it's a true ensemble cast. But all of these people seem to fade into the background when you take into account the main...
But I feel that there you're arguing that any story is not about the main characters, it's about the actions that they're taking during the story.
No.
Well, allow me to try to cut up the difference between you. Clashing tidal forces. It's sort of... You're both right to an extent. The fact is that, they're the weapon to uncover the truth, but someone has to be that in a certain sense. So it's not like... It's an ensemble piece that isn't necessarily about the characters, like you said, but nevertheless there have to be some kind of characters there. They weren't the focal point of it, like you said, true, but they also served the point of bringing this all to light.
I would say there were enough character moments in there to not just dismiss them as...
They tried to have moments of characterization, which were fine, perfectly fine.
No, not always, because...
For the most part, then.
I think everyone did a fine job acting. I didn't hate any of the people. I like Michael Keaton quite a bit. I'm glad to see him back in acting. I like Mark Ruffalo quite a bit.
I mean, he was Birdman, remember?
Yeah. Rachel McAdams, but I have nothing really against her. I'm a big fan of Liev Schreiber. But no one really... I think you're reaching for a protagonist because none of them were sufficient protagonists.
Well, collectively, that's what I'm trying to say. Like, they all count as one big single, like, the fourth estate, if you will.
I agree.
I'm not reaching...
The fourth... Actually, I like that quite a bit.
That's the protagonist, I guess. Go ahead.
I would say that I'm not reaching. That was the obvious protagonist to me. These are all characters in, propping up this story.
Yeah, so you're right. That's exactly right.
They all push this story to the forefront, every single one of them, and that's the entire point of their characters, because they're all trying to get the story out.
It's just difficult because we focus on narratives, but this is a weird, gray area because of the nature of the entire story and of the film. So, I mean, I actually was going to rate them 0 at first, but I may have convinced myself given what you guys just said.
Well, I'm going with a 0. And to the point earlier that I never mentioned up, there's this one part with a dramatic moment done by Mark Ruffalo.
Which kind of fell flat, true.
Because in a way it wasn't earned story narratively wise, and it felt kind of out of place.
You know what? I agree.
Because he tried to become a protagonist when he wasn't?
Well, no, I think let me try to rephrase it. It felt like a cookie cutter, rousing speech that had to happen in almost any film like this, but it didn't need to really be there.
No, it was attempting to, even worse than that, it was attempting to provide conflict for the protagonists.
But there didn't need to be any at all.
Yeah, because
they're on the same side.
Yeah, right, there wasn't really conflict for these people.
Yes, but
there was conflict for
because they're the protagonists, they were attempting to insert conflict in there. But we're going to argue this point until the blizzard swallows us whole.
I think something you just said there at the end convinced me that here, since we're interested in story and narrative, and if the story itself is the protagonist, then I'm going to give that a 1.
All right.
But I wasn't originally...
I'm going to give it a 1 as well, because...
I was not originally going to do that.
Well, Scott, then I guess we're going to wildly differ on this. Supporting characters.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. it's again difficult. You can say they're almost all supporting characters in service of the story. Yes,
Right.
Steve-O, thank you. Sure, so you're right. It depends what side of the coin you fall down on this one. 'Cause given that I've just given them credit in the previous question, if they're not secondary, if there's no secondary characters, if they're all secondary characters essentially, but rolled up into some sort of amorphous, like, again, collectively, the team is the protagonist and no single character within it, then they're all sort of fall to the sidelines. I guess you could say the people that interview the victims, some of the victims, but not even like, I don't think that even to that
Cardinal,
May I
the
give-
lawyers.
To
Sure.
in our old tradition of if there's one
The
supporting
lawyer.
character stands up, Stanley Tucci, I think,
he did a
owned
great
this
job.
film.
That's true.
Yeah.
But even more so than him, the one supporting character that I elevate above the rest is the invisible
Diamond.
psychiatrist on the phone.
All right.
I was
No,
going
well,
to say
he
the
was
same
good.
thing.
He appears
I love that
multiple
guy.
times. You never see him, and he's just a voice on the phone. And you hear, I think he has one of the most in-depth backstories
Yeah,
of any of the
and he gives them a lot
characters.
of like useful
And
facts.
the best part is, he has this voice that's so recognizable,
Yes, agreed.
although at the same time sounds like a voice that you've heard like 100 times before.
He sounds like he should be exactly who they say he
Yeah,
is.
exactly.
And it does. You're
Yeah.
right. I mean, that was a good little touch.
Whoever it was had the perfect voice for that role.
I do, in fact, agree with that. So it's,
Richard Jenkins.
okay.
All right.
Either way, yeah, he. It's funny because I think they even pointed out they lampshaded sort of in the film where somebody says, "You ever meet this guy?" He's like, "Nah, I've just only had some phone conversations with him." But every time I have a phone conversation with him, it's a very interesting scene, and yeah, because of just the sound of his voice and what he's saying in relation to what his character his backstory is supposed to be, is in fact interesting and helps them in their investigation. So you're right, this is a difficult one. I again originally was going to give it a 0, but I think you're right. Stanley Tucci did kill it in that role. He was he was again a helpful and important part of the investigation, although perhaps reluctantly at first, but he clearly wanted to help. He wanted to bring this to light. So maybe I've just convinced myself to count them enough to give them a 1.
I'm going to give it a 1 as well.
I'm going to give it a 1 too, and I would like to point out that I include the entire Spotlight team in supporting characters. So everybody was great, except for perhaps Mustache Man.
But
Matt.
he wasn't bad.
He was
He was
fine.
just, you know what? He was there.
He was-
okay?
Yeah, exactly.
He was a tertiary character.
Yeah.
So I'm on to dialogue now. It's okay.
It's factual. It's what it needs
Yes.
to be.
Scott, you had a. I don't want to misquote you here, but you in the prior times you've mentioned for dialogue that does nothing but service the plot. I think you had a term for it.
Workmanlike.
Workmanlike. Yeah, this was very workmanlike. I think there were a couple times I laughed during this, so there were. I assume a couple good jokes, but none that I can really bring to mind. However, there were moments in this that were over dramatic and heavy handed. So I gotta weigh it on the other side of. I think where this comes across to me is that this takes place in Boston. There are every single extra in this movie has a Boston accent, but none of the main cast.
Now Keaton does an okay job of trying to do a
Yeah.
Boston accent. Yes.
I feel that I was trying to pay attention to it, and I think at times he does it, and at times he doesn't.
There's certain words he can have a good Boston accent on, and others that he can't.
And then
I noticed that
they
too.
lampshaded a couple times. Tell that Rachel McAdams' character is not originally from Boston. Fair enough. Then Mark Ruffalo, like, where are you from? Oh, I'm from East Boston. You don't have an accent. And he just kind of shrugs
he
at the
blankly-
camera.
Yeah.
They literally almost hand wave it in the film, sure, but
Yeah,
that's not quite dialogue per se. Yes and no, but I get what you mean.
I was teetering on the edge because it's okay, but I think that drops me over.
I would kind of agree. The part of this that's memorable to me is the story of what happened, and I'm gonna remember like kind of the facts about it from this.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't I don't remember any of the dialogue really. It was just kind of like getting from procedural point A to
point B,
procedural
sure,
point B.
exactly.
And there were times, the only thing that I'm going to really remember are the times that it bugged me. And I think that I got to mark that against it. As much as I would like to say that it was good dialogue, I mean, we just finished watching this, 45 minutes ago? And I don't remember much of what the dialogue was. I just remember what happened, you know?
I think there's two ways you can go on this, and I'm trying to parse out which way I'm going to actually end up. You both, pretty much in both of your camps, that I didn't feel... All right, you're right. It approached cringeworthy maybe in two spots, one being the one you already mentioned, E. But Everything else felt pretty natural. Was it snappy? No, but again, it's not trying to be that. It was sort of like what people would be saying in these situations. I was very believable for 90% of it. I'll say that. So in that sense, I can't really fault it for not trying to do anything else with it, because if they had tried to be like put in little like haha funny moments, I would have disliked that.
I actually wanted to preempt you with that.
Okay.
But so I'll have to seem defensive. I agree completely that they should not have at all tried to snap this up. It's not
doesn't lend itself to that.
But and I have no problem with the procedural aspects of it where they give straight fact. The issue I have is they attempted to have character development moments. They have side parts with Mark. I think Mark Ruffalo particularly has.
He's got more
give
little
him the most
side stuff. Yeah,
side moments.
Agreed.
And every single time, these actors had nothing to work with. And these are all talented actors, and I did not care for any of their performances in here, and I have to fault whatever screenwriter. And so I have to assess it solely on those character moments, and none of those really worked for me.
All right.
Actually, you just made me think of something, and I would like to go back to characters for one brief moment and say that none of these characters developed, but the story...
They had 0 arcs, but the story had an arc. Yes, thank you, Don.
Had a full arc. And
all right.
I was thinking about that earlier, and I wanted to bring it up, which is why I bring it up now.
Yes, you're clever.
I kind of forgot to say that. But anyway, what I want to say about the dialogue is this movie reminded me of the 5th season of The Wire, except for the dialogue wasn't as good.
Okay.
And that's, there's something to be said for that. Like, the dialogue in The Wire, I still kind of remember. I finished that, 2 years ago. So I'm going to have to go with a 0 for the dialogue. It was fine. It didn't take me out of the movie, but it wasn't enough to take it over the top.
I was coin flipping, but I think I'm going to fall on a 0 as well.
I'm going to give it a 0 as well, as I said, for strictly the judging it on the character moments. So now we're on to style with Stephen Ramosi.
This film has a pretty straightforward
It's
style.
the same question, essentially, as dialogue. I'm going to preempt
it,
you with
it
that.
It is very similar. And it wasn't overwhelming. I thought that the other parts of the film carried it more than this.
The story carried it, not the style. We gotcha.
This movie was more about the content than the cinematography and the filmmaking and the soundtrack, which was almost non-existent, by the way.
There are a few musical scores here and there.
But it was very...
Usually you're the big soundtrack guy, and I noticed that myself. Good.
So, I don't think I can score style well either. And not that... I don't think that this type of film needs to have a great style. I enjoyed it. I found it very interesting. I don't want to say I enjoyed it because it's very dark subject matter.
We know you
enjoyed it. It's polarizing. Yeah. I get it though. Sure. So, you got anything? Yeah. I mean, here's the thing, right? Had they tried to do something crazy with the style, that would have detracted again from the overall message of it.
That would have taken away from the content.
It's unnecessary. Everything, workmanlike is the only way I can describe it best. Everything was there as it needed to be. It was almost like a documentary, kind of in that sense. But there was no reason to do it any other way. Therefore, we said it's a little dry, but there's nothing particularly wrong with it. But there's nothing particularly to elevate it. But again, the nature of this entire thing means that does not need to be the case. Right. So it drove it along, showed you what needed to be shown, didn't try to get fancy or flashy. Can I fault it for that? Probably not, but can I give it credit for that? I don't know. You can convince me.
Well, real quick, I'm going to give the style a 0 on this probably, but I don't think that it got in its way.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm actually going to give it credit for style because I've seen a lot of the other Oscar noms recently. I've seen a lot of great movies recently. This is the most film-like I've seen in a while, where it's not it's almost in a template movie.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So what I'm looking at is not for them to revolutionize the art of cinema here, but for them to create a pattern for the story to walk on. And I'm looking at how they used Boston. The set design for the Boston Globe was very interesting, but they did a lot of neat things with showing you different segments of
various
Boston,
parts of Boston,
especially when you're going to see the victims. And a lot of them live in the poorer kind of the ghetto areas of
Sure, which is an
Boston.
important part of the
So
their investigation.
you're seeing kind of row homes and people yelling at the reporters from balconies. And one of the neat little, oftentimes they had the church present in the background.
Yeah, I
see the
noticed that.
church
It's a nice touch.
towering in while they're trying to interview a victim or something.
And he
like
even
that.
lamps it. He goes, "Oh,
Yeah.
great, we're at a church," you know.
Yeah,
So-
well, they talk about having the Catholic high school
No, there's this one where
across
she's,
the way from the globe, and
but there's one where it's just this
Yeah.
humongous church
Mhm.
right in the background of the scene.
yeah.
So-
I mean, they do a lot of that for sure.
So, again, I think it did a fair enough job that I'm going to give it a 1 for it.
I mean, I agree. It's hard. You know what? I think I may switch because like what do you want them to do with it? And what they did, I think, was good. And little nice touches like that. As I think more about it, I think were well done. Sort of like insert it in the literally in the background sometimes. And I think that added to it. In fact, so yeah.
Still giving it a 0?
I don't know. This is
I
tough.
switched.
I think I'm gonna leave it at a 0 because I think what they did for the most part was try to keep the style out of the story's way.
See, like
And
both of those are
and-
great points. So it's hard for me.
like I would prefer that. I'm glad that they didn't try to do a lot of different and have all these cinematic techniques that were gave you all these different shots. I'm glad that they kind
Just
of
wanted
made it.
1% more?
No, I didn't want. I wanted the style to stay out of the story's way, and I'm glad they did that. That doesn't mean that I'm going to give the style a 1.
But see, that's what I'm saying. Like by that very fact means it's almost you know what I'm saying. You could use that same reasoning to give it a 1.
Yeah, but that's not a.
It's not a knock. I get it.
No, I would say that's not an up for the style. It's an up for the story. It's a completely
Alright.
different.
It's reinforcing
section.
another 1. So, we got style, and onto Scott for recommendation.
Yeah, I think again, it's similar in the same vein of The Big Short and other movies who attempt to do things like this. It's an important film to see because of the story itself, the story of the story, and how they uncovered it, and and the ripple effect of it, and what the repercussions it had in real life, and the people who were involved in fact digging it up and bringing it to light to the public. So yeah, again, of course it's not the most flashy film in the world, but that's not the point of it. The point of it is to be more aware of issues like this, and learn about them, learn the history of how they were first, again, like I said, uncovered by whoever happened to uncover it first, whoever was able to trace it deep enough to bring it to light, and sort of overcome the walls that were in place that to keep it buried from the public. So yeah, it's not the most uplifting of films, of course, but it's, I think, nevertheless important to see.
I would completely agree with that. There are probably a couple movies that are up for Oscars this year that are important to see, and there are probably a couple movies that are really enjoyable to see. And I think that you should probably watch all of them, at least the ones that I've seen so far. I've recommended all of them, but this one is important to see because it tells the story of what happened and what continues to happen and what has been happening for a long time in the church. And keeping that under wraps has been such a large part of what the church has been about, and I think that that's kind of messed up. And if the church ever wants to crawl out from underneath this pile of crap that they've heaped upon themselves, I don't know, I think they have to acknowledge things like this and kind of start to work their way forward from it.
Sure, I just want to point it's just kind of a loaded question because we're doing the Oscar noms, and it's hard to they're recommended it because they're fucking Oscar noms. I don't know.
I can't recommend this. Well,
Yeah.
I agree with everything you guys said, but in the review of Big Short, I had mentioned that
It's not as accessible.
I was hesitant about recommending The Big Short because I didn't, even though I found it a very exciting movie and a very interesting movie, I honestly didn't know how many people would be willing to learn through this. And this is a heavy movie, and it's an important message, but it's in a similar way recommending a documentary to someone. And I don't know how many how it can be successfully recommended.
Sure. Well, people want to be ignorant about these issues.
Well,
Yeah,
not
but-
just that, but it's willing to slog through this and be depressed by the end of this movie. I think I can recommend this to 10% of the people, but that means that 90% of the people I can't recommend this to.
Sure.
So that would ultimately have to be a 0.
I don't know. I would say I would recommend it to anybody, and
You recommend everything to everybody, though?
not everything. There are certainly movies that I've said don't watch this.
No, when you come across something intellectually of substantive, you tend to recommend things like
That's
that. And I feel
correct. And you know what? I mean, maybe it's a difference between like
Sure, it might not
I
be.
don't want to say that. I was going to say like optimism and pessimism between us. Maybe that's what it is. But like, I really want everybody to learn about this stuff, whereas you kind of think that they are not going to be willing to.
It's more difficult, probably, on average. I agree with that, but
a pragmatist.
Perhaps.
one by one, you got to make the population smarter and more aware of issues, and perhaps this might be a way to do it. So.
But I think that it would turn off more than it would convert.
Maybe, sure. I mean,
Right, but
it's
even if it turns
valid.
people off, that's probably people that were already either not going to know about this or turned off anyway.
Fair enough. But I'm going to stick by my setting, so unless there's
Fair
any
enough.
other thoughts,
Nope.
we'll go to the scores. Scott gave it the highest with a 9. Stephen Ormosi gave it an 8. And I gave it a 7, giving this an overall score of an 8, which I think very fair. It's a good movie.
I'm kind of surprised that I sort of changed a couple of my scores because going into this, I had a couple of foregone conclusions. So yeah, I think 8 is probably exactly where it should be.
I would agree.
So we're done for the evening. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Stephen Ormosi
Have a good night.
and Scott Thurlow.
I have nothing clever to say.
Rocked by Catholicism.
This has been Bon Mots. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Music by Chris Morgan. Editing and engineering by Stephen Hermosi. This has been a Lost Signals production. All rights reserved.